Hey guys, today we are stepping into a part of medieval life that sounds simple at first. The home. But the strange truth is that even the safest, wealthiest, most carefully kept medieval house could still feel smoky, damp, crowded, dusty, animal-scented, and never entirely clean in the way we would understand cleanliness today. Before we begin, let me know where you are watching from and what history topic you would like us to explore next. If you enjoy thoughtful long-form history like this, liking the video is a simple way to support it. And if you want more calm, quietly fascinating history, consider subscribing. So let us begin not with a castle or a battlefield or a king's court, but with a floor. A medieval floor could tell you almost everything about the life of a household. In a modest rural home, it might be packed earth, beaten down by years of feet, hooves, dripping cloaks, spilled ale, ash, rushes, and the slow grinding presence of daily work. It was not necessarily neglected. Often it was swept. It was renewed. Fresh reeds or rushes might be scattered over it, sometimes mixed with herbs for scent, softness, or the simple comfort of making a hard surface feel slightly more humane. But beneath that surface lay a problem that no broom could fully solve. Dirt was not an occasional intruder. Dirt was part of the architecture. This is one of the first things modern viewers often misunderstand about medieval homes. They imagine people simply did not care about cleanliness. But that is too easy, and it is not quite fair. Medieval people cared very much about order, smell, purity, presentation, and the management of filth. They washed objects. They scrubbed boards. They changed bedding when they could. They swept floors, aired rooms, beat textiles, emptied waste, and tried to keep vermin away. What made the home feel never truly clean was not laziness. It was the world the house belonged to. The medieval home was not separated from mud, animals, weather, smoke, food production, craft labor, and bodily waste in the way a modern home tries to be. It was not a sealed private interior. It was a working shelter inside a working landscape. Outside, streets could be unpaved or badly drained. Yards were shared with chickens, pigs, horses, dogs, carts, dung heaps, firewood, tools, soaking cloth, and vegetable scraps. People came in wearing shoes or boots that had passed through mud, straw, manure, market refuse, and the wet earth of fields. Children moved between house and yard. Animals sometimes moved closer than anyone today would find comfortable. And even when livestock were kept outside, the smell and texture of their world traveled indoors on clothing, hands, baskets, shoes, and air. A house did not begin clean and then become dirty. It began in conversation with dirt. In many poorer homes, there might be only one main room, or a very small number of spaces divided more by function than privacy. The same room could serve as kitchen, workshop, sleeping area, storage space, winter refuge, and place of social life. Food was chopped there. Wool might be carded there. Tools were repaired there. Babies were fed there. Shoes were dried there. Smoke gathered there. Wet clothes hung there. Someone sick might lie close to the fire while others continued ordinary work around them. The house was not a stage for comfort. It was a machine for survival. And in the center of that machine was fire. The hearth gave heat, light, cooked food, dried clothing, preserved life through winter, and gathered the family into one place. But the hearth also made the home filthy in a way that could not simply be wiped away. Smoke blackened beams, thatch, rafters, and walls. Soot settled into fabric. Ash moved underfoot. The smell of burning wood, peat, charcoal, or other fuels became part of the clothing, hair, bedding, and skin of the people living near it. In houses without a proper chimney, smoke rose through the room and escaped slowly through a roof opening, gaps, shutters, or the porous imperfections of the building itself. Even with improved chimney technology in later medieval homes, smoke did not vanish. It lingered, curled, stained, and reminded everyone that warmth came with a cost. This is one of those small reversals that helps us understand the medieval domestic world more clearly. The hearth was comfort, but it was also contamination. The very thing that made the house livable made it dirty. Imagine an evening in winter. The light is low. Outside, the ground is wet and cold. Inside, the fire is active, and the room has the golden glow that modern historical films often make beautiful. But the beauty has thickness. The air may sting the eyes. Meat, pottage, damp wool, smoke, tallow, rushes, bodies, and animals create a layered smell. The wall nearest the hearth is marked by heat and soot. The ceiling above is darkened. Utensils hang where they can be reached, but they also collect smoke residue. A bench has been wiped down, but hands keep touching it. The floor has been swept, but new mud has already entered. The rushes have been refreshed, but they still hide crumbs and dampness beneath them. Nothing in this scene is necessarily chaotic. It may be orderly according to the standards of the household, but order is not the same as cleanliness. For wealthier families, conditions could be better, but not magically modern. A townhouse of a prosperous merchant, or the domestic quarters of a manor, might have raised floors, plastered walls, separate chambers, better storage, more textiles, servants, and access to more fuel, water, and tools. There might be a hall for meals, a chamber for sleeping, a buttery, a pantry, a kitchen, and perhaps more specialized spaces. Yet wealth brought its own forms of dirt. More possessions meant more surfaces to maintain. More textiles meant more things to absorb odors. More servants meant more people moving through the house. More cooking meant more grease, steam, ash, and waste. More status meant greater anxiety over presentation. A medieval household was judged. Visitors noticed smell, order, hospitality, bedding, food, table manners, and the visible condition of the home. A dirty house could signal poverty, neglect, moral disorder, or poor management. So people tried. They did not live passively inside filth, but they were fighting with limited tools against an environment that kept renewing the problem. Water was central to this struggle, and water was never as simple as turning a tap. In towns, water might come from wells, conduits, rivers, fountains, or vendors. In villages, it might be drawn from a well, a stream, or a nearby source. Carrying water was labor. Heating water required fuel. Fuel cost money, time, or physical effort. A large wash was not a casual decision. It required vessels, fire, labor, space, and planning. This shaped what could be cleaned, how often, and how thoroughly. A modern person may look at a smoky floor or stained textile and wonder why it was not simply washed. But in the medieval home, washing was not just a preference. It was a calculation. Water itself could also be suspect. A clear stream might still receive runoff from animals, dyeing, tanning, brewing, butchery, or household waste. Urban water sources could be compromised by the density of life around them. Medieval people did not understand germ theory in the modern sense, but they were not blind to bad smells, foul water, or the danger of corruption. They often judged the healthfulness of an environment through smell, taste, appearance, and inherited medical ideas about air, balance, and decay. Some of their conclusions were wrong by modern standards. Some were practically useful. Either way, they knew that foulness mattered. The trouble was that foulness was everywhere. Kitchens, especially, were places where cleanliness was both essential and difficult. Food preparation created scraps, bones, grease, smoke, blood, peelings, spilled grain, sour milk, fish smell, and insects. In a modest home, the cooking space might be part of the main room. In larger houses, kitchens could be separate, partly because of fire risk and partly because serious cooking was messy, hot, and smoky. Pots were used repeatedly. Wooden boards held marks. Knives were wiped, sharpened, reused. Cloths absorbed grease. Floors near cooking areas became difficult to keep clean. Storage had to protect food from rats, mice, insects, damp, and theft. Bread, ale, cheese, salted meat, dried fish, beans, onions, herbs, and grains each had their own smells, textures, and vulnerabilities. A household that stored food well could survive. A household that stored food poorly could face hunger, sickness, or waste. Cleanliness, in this sense, was not aesthetic. It was practical discipline. But even the best discipline could be defeated by vermin. Rats, mice, Fleas, lice, flies, beetles, and other pests were part of the domestic landscape. They were not always visible, but they were expected. Straw bedding, rush-covered floors, stored grain, thatch, cracks in walls, warm hearths, and animal presence all created opportunities. Cats and dogs could help, but they also introduced their own smells, hair, fleas, and mess. Traps, storage jars, hanging food, sealed chests, and careful sweeping could reduce the problem. They could not erase it. This is another place where the medieval home becomes more complicated than the stereotype. People were not necessarily resigned to filth. They developed routines to manage it. They beat bedding. They aired cloth. They changed straw. They swept. They stored food above the ground. They used herbs, smoke, sun, and cold air as tools of domestic control. But the home was porous. Walls had cracks. Roofs leaked. Floors breathed dampness upward. Doors opened directly into the working world. Windows were not modern sealed glass barriers in most homes. The outside was always finding its way in. And then there was the matter of smell. Smell mattered deeply in medieval life. It carried social, medical, and moral meanings. Bad smells were not merely unpleasant. They could be associated with disease, corruption, sin, decay, poverty, or danger. Good smells, by contrast, might suggest order, sweetness, health, devotion, or refinement. Herbs scattered among rushes, flowers in season, clean linen, incense in religious settings, and aromatic woods or spices in wealthier homes all had meaning. A pleasant smell could be a sign that a household was being cared for. Yet scent was also used to cover what could not be removed. A rush-strewn floor might smell fresher when newly laid with sweet herbs, but the older material beneath could hold dampness, crumbs, fleas, and decay if not removed thoroughly. A chamber could be aired, but the bedding still carried human scent. Clothing could be brushed and hung, but smoke remained in the fibers. A bench could be scrubbed, but the room itself still held the memory of fire, food, and bodies. Medieval cleanliness often worked in layers. Remove what can be removed, cover what cannot, manage what returns. Privacy, too, was limited, and limited privacy made cleanliness harder. In many homes, people slept close together. Beds could be shared by family members, servants, guests, or apprentices depending on class and circumstance. Even in wealthier households, private sleeping chambers existed within a culture far less private than our own. Bodies were not hidden from household life in quite the same way. Illness, childbirth, washing, dressing, sleeping, and dying were more communal experiences. Bedding absorbed sweat, breath, oils, smoke, and the dust of the room. Linen sheets, where available, were important because linen could be washed more readily than heavy bedding. But washing them still required labor. A bed might be one of the most valuable objects in a household. It was furniture, status symbol, refuge, and storage of warmth. Curtains around a bed could provide privacy and help conserve heat. But curtains also gathered dust, smoke, and insects. Featherbeds, wool blankets, straw mattresses, and coverlets each required care. Straw could be replaced. Textiles could be aired. But the bed remained a place where comfort and impurity lived side by side. The medieval home was full of these contradictions. The thing that made life better also made cleaning harder. Textiles softened hard interiors, but absorbed odor. Rushes made floors more bearable, but trapped dirt. Fire gave warmth, but spread soot. Animals gave food, labor, security, and companionship, but brought fleas, dung, hair, and smell. Storage protected against hunger, but attracted pests. Thick walls gave shelter, but held damp. Small windows conserved heat, but limited light and airflow. To understand why medieval homes never truly felt clean, we have to hold these contradictions together rather than choosing the easiest version. It is tempting to imagine medieval people living in a kind of universal squalor. It is equally tempting, as a correction, to insist that they were much cleaner than people think. The truth is more interesting than either claim. They had standards. They had routines. They had ideas about freshness, purity, and domestic order. But they lived within material limits that made total cleanliness almost impossible. And those limits were not only technological, they were social. A household was not always a small nuclear family retreat. It could include apprentices, servants, lodgers, kin, laborers, guests, and dependents. Work and home overlapped. In town, a shop might open onto the street while the family lived above or behind it. Leatherworking, brewing, baking, spinning, weaving, metalwork, food selling, and other trades could bring materials and smells into domestic space. In the countryside, agricultural rhythms determined what entered the home. Muddy tools, wet garments, harvested crops, slaughtered animals, baskets of roots, wool, eggs, firewood, and the tired bodies of workers. The home was therefore not a clean container for private life. It was a node in an economy. This is why even a well-kept house could feel unfinished, unsettled, and constantly under pressure. Cleaning was not an event that restored the home to a perfect neutral state. Cleaning was a rhythm, a resistance, a daily pushing back against smoke, mud, hunger, weather, animals, insects, and human need. And the more closely we look, the more we notice that medieval cleanliness was often seasonal. In dry weather, dust could rise. In wet weather, mud entered. In winter, people sealed themselves more tightly indoors, bringing smoke, damp clothes, animals, and bodies into closer contact. In summer, smells intensified, insects multiplied, and food spoiled faster. Spring cleaning was not only a modern phrase of domestic freshness. Seasonal clearing, airing, repairing, and refreshing had deep practical logic in a world where winter trapped so much inside. Light also mattered. Many medieval interiors were dim compared with modern homes. Small windows, shutters, oiled cloth, horn panes, or limited glass meant that dirt could hide in shadow. A room might appear orderly in low light while still holding dust, soot, insects, or dampness in corners. Candlelight and firelight softened everything. They made interiors warm and atmospheric, but they also concealed the full reality of surfaces. When we imagine a medieval home at night, we should not picture the bright clarity of a museum reconstruction. We should picture layers of half-seen things. A pot near the hearth, a sleeping form under blankets, a wall darkened by smoke, a storage chest, hanging tools, a broom, a bundle of rushes, a dog shifting near the warmth, and somewhere beyond the door, the smell of yard, stable, street, and soil. The home was not separate from the world. It was the world gathered under a roof. And that roof had its own problems. Thatch, where used, could be practical, insulating, and locally available. But it could shelter insects, birds, rodents, and damp. Roof timbers could blacken from smoke. Leaks could stain walls and bedding. Dampness could creep into stored grain or cloth. In stone or timber houses alike, moisture was a constant enemy. A house might be cleaned thoroughly and still feel damp. And dampness is one of the most important parts of medieval discomfort because it is not dramatic. It does not announce itself like a battle or plague. It simply stays. Damp clothes dry slowly. Damp bedding feels heavy. Damp walls smell earthy. Damp rushes decay. Damp storage spoils food. Damp air makes smoke cling. Dampness turns cleanliness into something temporary. In this way, medieval homes were shaped by a quiet enemy that modern life has worked very hard to defeat: unmanaged moisture. The absence of modern heating, insulation, ventilation, plumbing, sealed windows, treated materials, and industrial cleaning agents meant that the home was always negotiating with the weather. And yet, within these homes, people built lives of meaning, tenderness, routine, and care. This matters. A medieval home was not simply disgusting. It was not merely backward or miserable. It was the place where children learned their first prayers and tasks, where bread was shared, where stories were told, where tools were passed down, where illness was endured, where marriages were negotiated, where wool was spun, where accounts were kept, where the old rested, and where the dead were remembered. Its uncleanness was not the absence of humanity. It was part of the burden under which humanity continued. The question, then, is not simply why medieval homes were dirty. The better question is why cleanliness was so hard to make permanent, even when people cared about it. To answer that, we have to move deeper into the daily routine itself. The sweeping, washing, airing, scrubbing, carrying, burning, covering, and clearing that turned medieval housekeeping into one of the most relentless forms of labor in ordinary life. To answer that, we have to move deeper into the daily routine itself. The sweeping, washing, airing, scrubbing, carrying, burning, covering, and clearing that turned medieval housekeeping into one of the most relentless forms of labor in ordinary life. For many households, the day began long before sunrise, and one of the first concerns was not making the home spotless but making it manageable. A house that had been occupied throughout the night needed to be awakened almost as much as its inhabitants. Embers from the previous evening's fire were carefully coaxed back into flame whenever possible, saving the effort and precious materials needed to kindle an entirely new blaze. As the fire revived, yesterday's ash had to be gathered. Some of it was removed, but not always discarded. Wood ash had practical value throughout the medieval household, and this is another small detail that reveals how different their understanding of domestic life was from ours. Ash could become an ingredient rather than merely a nuisance. Mixed with water, it produced an alkaline solution that helped loosen grease from cooking vessels or assisted in washing certain textiles. What modern people might sweep directly into a bin could instead become part of the next day's cleaning supplies. Even the residue of yesterday's fire entered another cycle of usefulness. Medieval housekeeping was built upon this constant habit of reuse because materials were rarely abundant enough to waste. Once the hearth had been tended, attention shifted to the room itself. Brooms were simple tools, usually fashioned from bundles of twigs, heather, birch, broom plant, or other local vegetation. Their appearance was humble, but their work was constant. Floors might be swept several times in a single day, particularly in households where cooking, spinning, food preparation, and animal care all overlapped within the same space. Yet sweeping accomplished only part of the task. A packed earth floor could not be scrubbed like modern hardwood or stone. Tiny particles settled into its surface. Moisture could bind dirt into the ground itself. Even wooden plank floors, increasingly common in wealthier houses, developed gaps between boards where crumbs, dust, soot, insects, and moisture quietly collected. Every sweep made the room better, but never entirely clean. It is striking how often medieval household manuals and estate accounts reveal concern for orderly maintenance rather than impossible perfection. There was an understanding that domestic care was continuous. One finished sweeping only because another sweeping would soon become necessary. Air itself presented another challenge. Modern buildings benefit from carefully engineered ventilation, but medieval homes relied largely upon doors, windows, roof openings, and fortunate weather. During pleasant seasons, shutters might remain open to encourage fresh air. Bedding could be carried outdoors. Linen hung across bushes or fences. Woolen blankets might be beaten with sticks to drive out dust and insects. Mattresses stuffed with straw occasionally had their filling replaced altogether. These moments of airing served several purposes simultaneously. Sunlight helped dry lingering dampness. Wind dispersed odors trapped in fabric. Physical beating loosened accumulated dust and discouraged some unwanted pests. Although medieval people did not understand bacteria in modern scientific terms, they recognized through long experience that stale, damp textiles became unpleasant and unhealthy. Here again we encounter an important historical distinction. Their explanations often differed from ours, but their observations were frequently careful. A room that smelled fresh after a day of open air genuinely felt healthier. Bedding dried beneath sunlight genuinely became more comfortable. Smoke lingering beneath rafters genuinely irritated the lungs and eyes. Their methods emerged from practical experience accumulated over generations. Laundry, however, represented an altogether larger undertaking. Today we often separate washing clothes into a background chore requiring little thought beyond pressing a button. In the medieval household, laundry demanded planning that could consume an entire day or even several days depending upon the size of the family and the quantity of textiles involved. Water first had to be collected, Buckets or pitchers traveled repeatedly between home and well, stream, or communal fountain. Each journey represented physical labor. Every gallon carried by hand reminded the household that clean water possessed weight long before it possessed convenience. Then the water needed heating. Heating large quantities over an open fire consumed fuel. Fuel itself represented another chain of labor involving cutting wood, gathering fallen branches, transporting timber, drying it properly, and storing it against rain. Every piece burned beneath a wash kettle had previously required hours of work before ever reaching the hearth. Only after these preparations could washing begin. Soap existed but was neither universally available nor inexpensive. Depending upon region and period, households employed mixtures involving animal fat, wood ash, lye solutions, or imported soaps purchased at considerable cost. Fine linen received more careful treatment than rough wool, while certain fabrics could not simply be immersed repeatedly without suffering damage. The physical work proved exhausting. Clothing was soaked, rubbed, twisted, beaten, rinsed, wrung out, and finally hung to dry. Larger pieces, such as blankets, demanded multiple people simply to lift them once saturated with water. Winter complicated everything further. Drying heavy cloth in cold, damp weather became painfully slow, while attempting to dry it indoors risked adding still more moisture to an already humid interior. It is perhaps no surprise that outer garments were often brushed, aired, repaired, and reused for considerable periods before undergoing complete washing. Linen undergarments, resting directly against the skin, generally received more frequent attention because they absorbed perspiration and oils that heavier wool garments did not directly contact. This layered system of clothing quietly supported medieval cleanliness in ways that are easy to overlook today. People might own relatively few garments, yet they understood that changing and washing the linen closest to the body could improve comfort and hygiene even when outer clothing remained in regular use. Wealthier individuals possessed more sets of linen and therefore greater flexibility. Poorer families often managed with far less, making careful maintenance all the more important. The same philosophy extended beyond clothing into nearly every object within the house. Wooden bowls, for example, demanded careful handling. Unlike glazed pottery or metal vessels, wood could absorb moisture, grease, and odor over time. After meals, they were cleaned promptly, dried thoroughly, and stored where air could circulate. Wooden spoons, chopping boards, kneading troughs, and drinking vessels all required similar attention. Iron cookware introduced different concerns. An iron cauldron suspended over the hearth accumulated soot externally while grease built internally. Scouring such vessels demanded abrasive materials like sand or ash. Even after cleaning, their blackened exterior remained. To modern eyes, this appearance might suggest neglect, yet much of that darkness resulted simply from continual exposure to smoke rather than accumulated filth. Furniture, too, reflected practical compromises. Large carved cupboards that survive in museums often belong to unusually prosperous households. Most ordinary homes contained relatively little furniture. Benches served multiple purposes throughout the day. Chests functioned simultaneously as storage, seating, and occasionally tables. Simplicity reduced certain cleaning burdens while introducing others. A storage chest protected clothing from dust and vermin, but only if it remained reasonably dry inside. Moisture trapped within could encourage mold or damage valuable textiles. Nothing in the medieval home could simply be forgotten. Every neglected corner risked becoming a place where dampness lingered, insects multiplied, or food spoiled. One particularly demanding responsibility involved maintaining sleeping materials. Straw mattresses did not last indefinitely. Over time, the straw compressed, absorbed moisture, and attracted insects. Households periodically emptied ticking, replaced old stuffing with fresh material, and stitched everything closed once more. Featherbeds offered greater comfort for those who could afford them, but feathers themselves required careful drying and occasional renewal. Blankets needed airing. Bed curtains accumulated smoke and dust. Even pillows possessed their own maintenance cycle. The effort devoted to bedding reminds us how profoundly sleep depended upon household labor. A comfortable night's rest was never entirely separate from cleaning. Comfort had to be produced continuously. As the seasons changed, these routines shifted. Spring often encouraged larger domestic tasks postponed during harsh weather. Walls could be inspected for winter damage, roofs repaired, chimneys cleared more thoroughly, storage containers emptied and examined before fresh harvests eventually arrived. Household textiles enjoyed longer hours outdoors beneath strengthening sunlight. Summer introduced its own pressures. Flies became persistent companions. Meat spoiled more rapidly. Dairy products demanded careful attention. Odors intensified beneath warmer temperatures. Windows and doors stood open more frequently, improving airflow while inviting insects, dust, and animals inside. Autumn transformed the household again. Harvest-filled buildings with grain sacks, vegetables, preserved fruits, firewood, and salted provisions intended to sustain the family through winter. Storage spaces grew crowded. Every corner acquired importance. A careless leak in the roof or unnoticed moisture beneath stored grain could quietly threaten months of preparation. Winter narrowed the world. Doors remained closed against bitter winds. Smoke thickened inside. Wet cloaks hung drying near the fire. Boots tracked slush and mud indoors before freezing again outside. Family members remained together for longer hours beneath one roof, sharing warmth but also sharing every smell, cough, and trace of daily life. These seasonal rhythms explain something subtle yet deeply revealing. The medieval home never reached a permanent state called clean. Instead, it moved continually between better and worse conditions depending upon weather, workload, available labor, available fuel, harvest success, illness, and simple exhaustion. If someone within the household became sick, ordinary cleaning routines often suffered immediately. A family caring for an elderly parent, an injured laborer, or a feverish child naturally redirected time and energy toward nursing rather than sweeping. Cooking changed. Bedding required more frequent attention. Water demands increased. Waste became more difficult to manage. Domestic order, already fragile, could deteriorate surprisingly quickly under the pressure of illness. Yet medieval communities understood this burden. Neighbors, relatives, servants, guild members, and religious institutions sometimes assisted households struggling through sickness or bereavement. Practical domestic help could become an act of charity every bit as meaningful as providing food or money. This reminds us that housekeeping was rarely an isolated individual responsibility. It often depended upon networks of cooperation extending beyond the walls of the house itself. Indeed, many domestic tasks became opportunities for shared labor. Women might gather together at communal washing places, exchanging news while scrubbing linen. Servants worked collectively in larger households. Children gradually learned sweeping, carrying water, gathering fuel, feeding animals, and countless other responsibilities according to their age and ability. These ordinary routines rarely appear in chronicles celebrating kings or battles. Yet they formed the quiet foundation beneath medieval civilization itself. Castles, monasteries, market towns, and royal courts all ultimately depended upon thousands of households performing these repetitive acts of maintenance day after day, year after year. Without clean enough cooking vessels, preserved food, reasonably maintained bedding, usable clothing, and functioning hearths, the larger structures of medieval society could not have endured. And as we look even more closely at these seemingly ordinary routines, another unexpected question begins to emerge. If keeping an ordinary home clean demanded so much labor from an entire household, what happened when the house itself became larger, wealthier, and filled not with one family, but with dozens or even hundreds of people living beneath the same roof? And as we look even more closely at these seemingly ordinary routines, another unexpected question begins to emerge. If keeping an ordinary home clean demanded so much labor from an entire household, what happened when the house itself became larger, wealthier, and filled not with one family, but with dozens or even hundreds of people living beneath the same roof? At first glance, it is tempting to imagine that wealth solved the problem. A prosperous manor house or an urban merchant's residence possessed more servants, better furnishings, stronger walls, glazed windows in some rooms, and an architecture that separated kitchens, sleeping chambers, storerooms, and reception spaces more effectively than the single-room homes of many villagers. Yet the very scale of these residences created an entirely new set of domestic challenges. Every additional room represented another space that accumulated dust, soot, moisture, and wear. Every extra fireplace generated more ash to remove. Every staircase required sweeping. Every tapestry hanging upon a wall became another vast surface quietly collecting smoke, candle residue, and airborne dust. A medieval great hall, impressive though it appeared, was not simply an elegant dining room. It was often the beating heart of an entire household. Meals were served there, legal matters might be heard there, guests welcomed, celebrations held, servants organized, and household business conducted beneath its lofty roof. On busy days, dozens of boots crossed its floor from morning until evening. Dogs wandered beneath benches hoping for scraps. Messengers entered carrying mud from distant roads. Fire burned almost continuously through colder months. The hall therefore remained one of the busiest, and consequently one of the hardest spaces to keep orderly. Household ordinances from noble estates occasionally reveal just how much attention was devoted to maintaining appearances. Floors were to be swept before important meals, tables wiped, benches arranged, rushes renewed when necessary, candlesticks cleaned of dripping wax, drinking vessels polished, not because perfection could be achieved, but because visible care reflected the discipline of the household itself. In medieval society, the condition of a great house carried political meaning. Visitors judged more than architecture. They judged management. A well-run household suggested a capable lord or lady. Order among servants hinted at effective authority. Generous hospitality implied prosperity, while neglected surroundings could quietly damage reputation. Cleanliness, therefore, existed not only as practical labor but as a form of social communication. This introduces another subtle misunderstanding that modern audiences sometimes bring to the Middle Ages. We often divide cleanliness into personal hygiene on one side and household chores on the other. Medieval people certainly distinguished between body, clothing, and home, yet all three were closely connected to ideas of good governance. A disciplined household reflected disciplined leadership. This expectation extended particularly to the lady of the manor or the senior woman responsible for domestic oversight. Although she rarely performed every physical task herself in wealthy households, surviving household guides and literary sources suggest she supervised storage, provisioning, textile care, servants, and countless details that determined whether the home functioned smoothly. The ideal was not constant personal labor but careful management. Even so, servants themselves lived far from comfortable conditions. A noble family might dine beneath decorated beams while servants hurried through smoky kitchens where enormous cauldrons simmered over open fires from dawn until late evening. Kitchens in larger residences operated almost like workshops. Bread ovens radiated intense heat. Meat roasted before massive hearths. Fish required cleaning. Vegetables needed chopping. Ale and wine were transported from cellars. Scullions scrubbed utensils blackened by soot. The kitchen floor was perhaps among the most demanding places in the entire household. Grease inevitably found its way onto stone or packed surfaces. Water spilled constantly. Ash drifted from hearths. Bones accumulated before disposal. Vegetable peelings, flour dust, charcoal fragments, animal blood from butchery, and countless small scraps appeared throughout the day despite every effort to contain them. Cleaning was therefore continuous rather than occasional. Between meals, servants swept. After meals, they swept again. Before dawn preparations began, they swept once more. Yet anyone entering after a busy day would still notice smoke hanging beneath the rafters and evidence of relentless work. The same contradiction appeared in medieval monasteries. Many modern visitors imagine monasteries as exceptionally clean places because they represented spiritual discipline. In some respects, this was true. Monastic rules often encouraged orderliness, regulated routines, and communal responsibility. Cloisters were swept, dormitories maintained, kitchens organized according to established customs. Yet monasteries were also remarkably busy communities. Large abbeys housed dozens or even hundreds of monks, lay brothers, servants, guests, pilgrims, and laborers. Food had to be prepared on a substantial scale. livestock cared for, workshops maintained, gardens cultivated, libraries protected from dampness, infirmaries managed. Every one of these activities generated its own forms of dirt. The infirmary, for example, demanded frequent laundering of linens and blankets. Kitchens generated endless smoke. Scriptoria, where manuscripts were copied, required careful protection from soot, moisture, and insects that might damage precious parchment. Books themselves reveal another fascinating aspect of medieval domestic life. Modern readers often picture medieval manuscripts as pristine objects resting untouched beneath glass. In reality, they lived within active environments. Dust settled upon bindings. Candle smoke darkened pages over generations. Wax occasionally dripped onto margins. Leather covers absorbed odors from the buildings that housed them. Librarians and monks therefore became caretakers not only of knowledge but of cleanliness. A manuscript neglected in damp conditions could warp. Mold might attack parchment. Rodents occasionally chewed bindings. Even tiny insects posed genuine threats. Once again, maintenance proved inseparable from survival. The same careful attention extended to food storage. Pantries and cellars represented some of the most closely watched spaces within prosperous households because the consequences of neglect could become catastrophic. Grain had to remain dry. Salted meat needed protection from moisture while avoiding contamination by rodents. Cheese required careful conditions. Ale casks demanded inspection for leaks. Wine barrels needed maintenance. Apples, onions, beans, peas, and root vegetables each possessed their own preferred storage conditions. Today, refrigeration quietly performs much of this work without demanding our attention. Medieval households substituted vigilance. Someone constantly inspected supplies. Small changes, a damp patch beneath a barrel, unusual mold, evidence of gnawing, an unfamiliar smell, could signal losses affecting an entire season. Interestingly, medieval architecture itself attempted to assist wherever possible. Many stone houses featured cool undercrofts or cellars whose naturally lower temperatures slowed spoilage. Grain lofts occupied upper stories where airflow helped reduce moisture. Smokehouses preserved meat through controlled exposure to smoke. Yet every architectural solution introduced fresh responsibilities. A cellar remained cool, but could become damp. An attic remained airy, but invited birds or rodents if poorly sealed. Nothing remained effortless. Even decorative objects required attention. Richly woven tapestries served practical as well as aesthetic purposes. Hung upon stone walls, they helped reduce drafts and made great chambers noticeably warmer. They softened echoes. They proclaimed wealth through intricate designs. Yet every tapestry also behaved like an enormous sponge. Smoke settled into its fibers. Dust accumulated across its surface. Insects occasionally attacked natural wool. Removing and beating such heavy textiles demanded several people. Consequently, although tapestries improved comfort considerably, they also represented another layer of maintenance hidden behind their beauty. Wooden paneling behaved similarly. Oak walls developed darker tones through generations of exposure to smoke and candlelight. Modern visitors sometimes admire this deep coloring as attractive antiquity, forgetting that medieval occupants experienced it gradually, year after year, as the ordinary consequence of open flames illuminating nearly every evening. Candles themselves deserve closer attention. Unlike electric lighting, candles constantly transformed solid wax into smoke, soot, and drifting particles. Tallow candles, common in many households, often produced stronger odors than expensive beeswax candles. Candle holders required scraping. Wax dripped onto tables, floors, and textiles. Wall surfaces nearest frequent lighting slowly darkened. Light literally left residue. This quiet reality shaped every interior. Even where careful servants cleaned diligently, microscopic particles from countless evenings slowly settled across furniture, beams, clothing, and stored possessions. Glass windows, where available, introduced another interesting paradox. To modern eyes, glass suggests cleanliness because it admits abundant daylight. Medieval glass, however, often consisted of many small panes joined with lead. Its surface contained tiny irregularities that softened incoming light. Dirt accumulated externally from weather and internally from smoke. Cleaning required ladders, cloths, and considerable care because replacement remained expensive. Many households therefore accepted windows that were reasonably clear rather than perfectly transparent. Again, we encounter the medieval preference for sufficiency over unattainable perfection. Another source of persistent disorder came from footwear. People rarely removed shoes immediately upon entering every interior space, as is customary in many cultures today. Leather shoes collected mud, straw, manure, and street debris before crossing thresholds. Servants might spread fresh rushes, place mats near entrances, or sweep repeatedly, but complete separation between outdoors and indoors remained impossible. In castles especially, movement never truly stopped. Messengers arrived unexpectedly. Stable workers carried equipment. Hunters returned with game. Craftsmen entered to repair furniture, sharpen tools, or inspect roofs. Travelers sought hospitality. Priests visited chapels. Children raced through corridors. Every arrival carried traces of another landscape beneath their feet. The house breathed with the outside world. Perhaps nowhere was this relationship more visible than around entrances themselves. Doorways became transition zones where mud collected, cloaks were shaken, boots scraped, and deliveries unloaded. In rainy weather they grew particularly troublesome. Buckets, baskets, barrels, sacks, and firewood all crossed these thresholds daily. The entrance therefore demanded almost constant attention simply because it connected domestic order with the unpredictable conditions beyond the walls. And outside those walls lay another reality modern viewers sometimes overlook. Medieval towns possessed no unified sanitation departments in the modern sense. Responsibility for waste disposal often rested with individual households, neighborhood customs, local regulations, or guild obligations. Some towns maintained ordinances requiring residents to keep areas before their homes reasonably clear. Others employed workers for particular tasks. Enforcement varied widely according to region, wealth, and period. Even where regulations existed, success remained uneven. Rain transformed refuse into mud. Animals scattered discarded material. Market days filled streets with temporary congestion. Craft industries such as tanning, dyeing, or butchery introduced powerful smells and difficult waste products. No household existed in isolation from these wider urban conditions. The effort spent sweeping a floor indoors could be partly undone within moments of stepping outside and returning again. Yet, despite these relentless pressures, medieval people developed a remarkable resilience toward ordinary maintenance. Cleaning was not viewed as an exceptional project reserved for weekends or annual rituals. It formed the quiet rhythm beneath almost every waking day. One servant replenished firewood while another carried water. Someone scrubbed bowls while another mended clothing. Rushes were gathered from nearby wetlands. Ashes emptied. Linen inspected. Tools returned to their places. Bread covered. Animals fed. Doors secured. These countless small actions rarely appeared in chronicles because they were too ordinary to record. Yet without them, medieval society would have unraveled astonishingly quickly. And perhaps nowhere does this become clearer than when we leave the great houses and prosperous town residences altogether, and step instead into the places where cleanliness became most difficult of all. Not because people cared less, but because almost every available resource had to be devoted simply to surviving another day. And perhaps nowhere does this become clearer than when we leave the great houses and prosperous town residences altogether, and step instead into the places where cleanliness became most difficult of all. Not because people cared less, but because almost every available resource had to be devoted simply to surviving another day. For the overwhelming majority of medieval Europeans, life unfolded not inside castles or wealthy merchant houses, but in modest cottages scattered across villages, hamlets, and isolated farmsteads. These homes were built from the materials the surrounding landscape could provide. Timber cut from nearby woodland, wattle woven from flexible branches, clay mixed into daub, rough fieldstone where it was abundant, and roofs thatched with straw, reeds, or heather. Such buildings were remarkably well adapted to local conditions, yet they remained in constant conversation with the natural world. They expanded and contracted with changing weather. Rain found weaknesses. Wind carried dust through tiny gaps. Insects discovered hidden crevices. Mice slipped beneath thresholds that could never be perfectly sealed. The very materials that made these homes affordable also ensured that absolute cleanliness remained out of reach. A wall of wattle and daub, for example, might appear solid from a distance, but its surface gradually developed small cracks as seasons passed. Families repaired them regularly with fresh clay mixtures, especially after harsh winters. This maintenance was essential not only for warmth but also for limiting drafts, insects, and moisture. Yet, until repairs were completed, every tiny opening allowed a little more of the outside world to enter. That relationship between house and landscape shaped daily life more profoundly than modern observers often imagine. A farmhouse stood at the center of an active working environment rather than apart from it. Firewood was stacked nearby. Vegetable plots bordered the dwelling. Chickens scratched in the yard. Pigs rooted through refuse. Sheep or cattle grazed within walking distance. Water came from a nearby well or stream. Every chore carried family members repeatedly between indoors and outdoors, sometimes dozens of times each day. Every return brought traces of the fields back inside. Mud clung stubbornly to leather footwear. Fragments of straw lodged themselves in clothing. Bits of hay, dried leaves, loose feathers, animal hair, damp earth, and wood shavings quietly accumulated upon floors. A newly swept cottage could begin collecting fresh debris within minutes, not because anyone had failed in their work, but because the rhythm of agricultural life made complete separation impossible. Harvest season illustrated this particularly well. When grain ripened, the entire household became involved. Sheaves arrived from the fields. Bundles were carried into barns or temporary storage. Dust from dried stalks floated through the air. Chaff settled upon clothing and hair. Children gathered scattered ears of grain. Tools leaned against walls awaiting tomorrow's labor. The cottage itself temporarily became part of the harvest process. Likewise, during lambing season or periods of severe winter weather, particularly valuable or vulnerable animals might spend time surprisingly close to human living spaces. Historians debate how frequently livestock actually shared the main room in different regions and centuries, and the answer varies considerably. Earlier popular histories often exaggerated the practice, imagining cows and families permanently living side by side. The reality appears more nuanced. In some places, animals occupied separate byres attached to the house or positioned immediately beside it. Elsewhere, temporary indoor shelter was indeed provided under difficult conditions. Either arrangement still affected the atmosphere of the home. Even when animals remained behind an adjoining wall, warmth, sounds, moisture, odors, and insects easily crossed architectural boundaries. A calf shuffling in the next compartment, chickens fluttering outside the doorway, or sheep sheltering nearby all contributed to an environment where human domestic life remained deeply intertwined with animal husbandry. This closeness was practical before it was pleasant. Livestock represented wealth, labor, milk, wool, transport, breeding stock, and future security. Protecting them during severe weather often meant protecting the family's survival. If the result was a house that smelled less than fresh by modern standards, that was a compromise many households accepted willingly. The same practical mindset shaped attitudes toward clothing. A peasant family owned relatively few garments compared with modern wardrobes. Every item required substantial labor to produce. Wool had first to be sheared, cleaned, carded, spun into thread, woven into cloth, fulled, perhaps dyed, then cut and sewn. Linen demanded even greater patience, beginning with the cultivation and processing of flax before spinning could even begin. Because clothing represented so much work, people treated it with extraordinary care. Small tears were mended quickly before becoming larger ones. Sleeves might be replaced while preserving the rest of a tunic. Worn garments could be altered for younger family members. Eventually, badly damaged cloth became patches, then cleaning rags, then stuffing, before finally reaching the end of its usefulness. This economy of reuse affected cleanliness in subtle ways. People brushed dirt away rather than washing unnecessarily. Mud was allowed to dry before being beaten from fabric. Smoke odors lingered because frequent washing risked damaging valuable textiles and consumed precious resources. Garments therefore reflected a careful balance between preservation and cleanliness rather than an endless pursuit of freshness. Shoes tell a similar story. Most medieval footwear consisted of leather that demanded maintenance if it was to survive repeated exposure to wet ground. Owners cleaned away caked mud whenever possible, rubbed leather with fats or oils to preserve flexibility, repaired worn soles, and stitched broken seams. Yet no amount of care could prevent muddy roads from undoing much of that effort after the next journey. Indeed, the condition of medieval roads deserves a closer look, because the home could never be cleaner than the paths leading toward it. Many village tracks consisted simply of earth compacted by generations of feet, carts, and animals. During dry weather they produced dust. During prolonged rain they transformed into thick mud capable of swallowing wheels and clinging stubbornly to boots. Drainage varied enormously depending upon local geography and investment. Some settlements maintained sections of road carefully. Others struggled continually against erosion. Returning home after market day often meant carrying the road indoors. Imagine a farmer arriving late in autumn. His cloak has collected moisture from mist and drizzle. His boots are heavy with clay. A sack of grain rests across his shoulder. Firewood has been gathered along the way. A dog follows close behind. As the door opens, cool damp air enters with him. The cloak must be hung near the fire. Boots scraped as best they can be, wood stacked for later use. Grain stored safely. The dog settles near the hearth, shaking loose a few droplets of muddy water. Within only a few minutes, the morning sweeping has begun to disappear beneath the practical realities of everyday life. Yet this should not be mistaken for carelessness. In fact, visitors from outside the household would probably notice many signs of careful management. Cooking vessels hang neatly from hooks. Wood has been stacked to dry. Tools occupy familiar places. Food stores remain covered. The broom rests close to the doorway, ready for frequent use. Children have learned where objects belong. Order existed not because everything remained spotless, but because everyone understood their responsibilities. One particularly revealing aspect of medieval domestic life involves the treatment of waste. Today we often imagine medieval villages drowning beneath refuse, yet surviving evidence suggests a more complicated picture. Organic waste possessed value. Vegetable scraps might feed pigs. Manure fertilized fields. Ash found new uses. Bones could become tools or be processed for other purposes. Cloth fragments entered repair work. Nothing was discarded casually when another purpose remained possible. Even so, some waste inevitably accumulated. Human waste management varied considerably according to location, wealth, and local custom. Rural households generally relied upon simple privies, pits, or fields away from immediate living areas. These arrangements required regular attention. Neglect created unpleasant conditions not only through smell but by attracting insects and contaminating nearby water if poorly located. Medieval people understood this through observation, even if their explanations differed from modern environmental science. A badly maintained privy offended the senses. A contaminated well endangered the household. A stagnant pool bred unpleasant odors and insects. Their language often described corruption, foul air, or imbalance rather than microbes, but practical experience taught many of the same lessons about careful placement and regular maintenance. Water itself remained one of the household's greatest daily investments. A modern faucet conceals remarkable engineering behind effortless convenience. Medieval families encountered every stage directly. Buckets required lifting. Shoulders bore weight. Hands numbed during winter collections. Wells occasionally froze. Streams flooded. Drought reduced supplies. Every gallon carried into the home represented physical labor that naturally influenced how generously it could be used. Consequently, water was respected. Spilled water meant wasted effort. Excessive washing demanded explanation. Children learned early not to squander what had taken time and strength to obtain. This economy shaped bathing as well. Contrary to popular myth, medieval people did bathe. Public bathhouses flourished in many towns during parts of the Middle Ages, particularly before later social and medical changes altered their popularity. Wealthier households owned tubs. Rural families improvised with wooden vessels or basins whenever circumstances permitted. The difficulty lay not in understanding the pleasure of bathing, but in arranging it. Enough water had to be collected, enough fuel gathered, enough time spared from agricultural labor, enough privacy created. A full bath therefore became an event requiring preparation rather than an impulsive daily habit. More common were partial washings of the face, hands, and exposed skin, especially before meals, religious observances, or important social occasions. Clean hands mattered during eating because fingers frequently replaced utensils for much of the meal. Household basins and ewers therefore occupied surprisingly important places within better-equipped homes. Hospitality itself often began with water. Guests of status might be offered an opportunity to wash their hands before dining. Servants poured water over waiting fingers into basins below. Towels followed. Such rituals carried practical and symbolic significance simultaneously. They refreshed travelers while demonstrating the host's generosity and refinement. Once again, cleanliness expressed relationships as much as hygiene. The home also possessed its own soundscape of maintenance. The scrape of a broom across packed earth. The hollow rhythm of carpet beaters striking blankets. The hiss of water poured into hot cauldrons. The crackle of damp firewood. The creaking of storage chests opening for inspection. The rhythmic scraping of knives against wooden boards being cleaned. These sounds formed the unnoticed background music of domestic life. Because they occurred every day, chroniclers rarely mentioned them. Yet anyone transported into a medieval village would hear housekeeping almost continuously. Morning began with sweeping, midday with cooking, afternoon with washing or mending, evening with arranging bedding, banking fires, securing animals, and preparing the household for another night. Each completed task quietly prepared the next. This endless cycle reveals something deeply human. The medieval home was never conquered by cleanliness once and for all. Instead, every sunrise reopened the negotiation between order and disorder. Families understood this instinctively. They did not expect a permanently spotless house because experience taught them that smoke would return. Mud would return, ash would return, dampness would return, and tomorrow's labor would begin almost exactly where today's had ended. But there was one element of the medieval household that challenged even the most diligent family more stubbornly than smoke, mud, or ash. It was an adversary too small to ignore, too persistent to eliminate, and so familiar that nearly every home, rich or poor, eventually found itself learning to live alongside it. But there was one element of the medieval household that challenged even the most diligent family more stubbornly than smoke, mud, or ash. It was an adversary too small to ignore, too persistent to eliminate, and so familiar that nearly every home, rich or poor, eventually found itself learning to live alongside it. The medieval world was, quite simply, alive with insects. For modern listeners, it is easy to imagine an occasional fly drifting through an open window or a spider appearing in the corner of a room. Medieval homes, however, existed in an ecological balance that was far less controlled than our own. The boundaries between human shelter and the countless smaller creatures inhabiting the surrounding landscape remained remarkably porous. Wood, straw, wool, feathers, grain, livestock, and stored food all created habitats in which insects and other small creatures could thrive. This did not mean that every medieval house was constantly overrun. Conditions varied enormously according to climate, season, wealth, construction, and household discipline. But it did mean that almost every family expected occasional unwelcome companions. Perhaps the most persistent were fleas. The flea's success came from its extraordinary adaptability. It could live on dogs, cats, rodents, livestock, and humans alike. A household might work tirelessly to keep sleeping areas fresh, regularly replacing straw or airing bedding. Yet if a favorite dog slept near the hearth or mice occupied hidden spaces within the walls, the insects could quietly return. This is another place where modern assumptions deserve careful adjustment. People were not unaware of fleas, nor were they indifferent to them. Surviving texts, household advice, medical writings, and even literary jokes all demonstrate that fleas were widely recognized as an irritation. Remedies were proposed. Bedding was aired. Herbs were sometimes placed among straw. Animals were groomed. Floors were swept. Yet every successful effort was temporary. The flea belonged not only to the home but to the wider environment. The same could be said for lice. Head lice and body lice were unfortunate companions in many societies throughout history, not because people lacked concern for cleanliness, but because close living conditions, shared bedding, limited wardrobes, and constant physical proximity allowed these parasites to spread easily. Combing hair, therefore, served several purposes. A comb untangled knots. It removed loose dirt. It distributed natural oils. And, just as importantly, it allowed careful inspection. Archaeologists have recovered finely made combs from many medieval sites, some carved from bone or antler with remarkably narrow teeth. Their craftsmanship reminds us that grooming mattered. Hair was not ignored. It was maintained using the tools available. Children, especially, likely sat patiently, or perhaps impatiently, while parents or older siblings worked carefully through their hair beside the light of an open doorway or window. These moments reveal a side of medieval domestic life that rarely appears in grand historical narratives. They were intimate. They required patience rather than strength. They belonged to ordinary affection as much as necessity. Meanwhile, flies presented an entirely different challenge. Unlike fleas or lice, flies announced themselves openly. Kitchens attracted them. Freshly prepared food invited them. Animal byproducts encouraged them. Warm summer weather multiplied their numbers dramatically. Households responded in practical ways. Food might be covered with cloth. Preparation areas cleaned promptly after meals. Waste removed before it lingered unnecessarily. Doors partially closed when possible. Smoke itself, though unpleasant for humans, occasionally discouraged insects to a limited degree, adding another small irony to the medieval home. The very hearth that blackened ceilings could also reduce some flying pests. Yet complete victory remained impossible. Anyone who has left food uncovered during a warm afternoon without modern screens understands the challenge immediately. Now imagine facing that challenge every summer without sealed windows, refrigeration, insecticides, or tightly enclosed kitchens. The medieval household relied instead upon constant attention. Even grain storage attracted its own enemies. Tiny beetles and weevils threatened precious harvests. A few unnoticed insects within stored grain might multiply quietly over weeks or months. Families therefore inspected supplies regularly, turning grain, checking containers, and remaining alert for signs of spoilage. Again, cleanliness blended seamlessly into food security. The careful maintenance of storage areas determined not merely comfort but survival. Rodents complicated matters further. Mice and rats possessed extraordinary talent for discovering forgotten openings. A gap beneath a door, a crack near a foundation, loose thatch, or poorly fitted boards could become an invitation. Once inside, they searched tirelessly for grain, scraps, cloth suitable for nesting, or warmth during colder months. Cats became valued household companions for obvious reasons. Although medieval people appreciated cats for many different qualities depending upon culture and period, their usefulness as hunters made them particularly welcome around food stores. A capable cat protected grain more effectively than almost any human could. Even so, the relationship remained imperfect. A cat might reduce the rodent population significantly while simultaneously introducing fleas into the house. Once again, every practical solution carried another practical complication. This pattern appears again and again throughout medieval domestic history. Nothing existed in isolation. Everything interacted. The fire that dried damp clothing also produced soot. The dog that guarded livestock might carry parasites. The rushes that softened hard floors concealed crumbs. The thick wool blankets that provided winter warmth also created inviting shelter for insects. Understanding medieval cleanliness, therefore, requires abandoning the modern expectation that every problem possesses a permanent technological solution. Instead, medieval households practiced management. Management rather than elimination. Reduction rather than perfection. Control rather than conquest. This way of thinking extended beyond insects into the very smell of the home itself. Modern houses often strive toward neutrality. We notice unusual odors precisely because ordinary indoor air has become relatively scentless. Medieval interiors were entirely different. Every building possessed a recognizable character formed by its construction materials, fuel, occupants, food, and surrounding landscape. Fresh-cut timber smelled different from aged oak. Lime plaster carried its own subtle scent. Smoke varied according to whether oak, beech, peat, charcoal, or brushwood fueled the fire. Bread baking produced warm sweetness. Ale fermentation contributed another layer. Dry herbs hanging from rafters released faint fragrances whenever disturbed. Leather boots drying beside the hearth announced recent travel. Wet wool cloaks introduced the smell of rain-soaked fields. The medieval home therefore possessed what we might call an environmental identity. Visitors likely recognized familiar households partly by scent long before they noticed individual furnishings. This may sound unusual to modern ears, yet smell formed an important part of how people interpreted their surroundings. Medical theories of the period frequently connected health with the quality of air. Although based upon ideas very different from modern microbiology, these beliefs encouraged practical habits. Rooms were aired. Sweet-smelling herbs were valued. Stagnant water inspired concern. Rotting material was removed when possible. Incense served both religious and practical purposes. Fragrant plants such as lavender, rosemary, mint, rue, or southernwood appeared in various household contexts depending upon region, availability, and local custom. It would be misleading to imagine every peasant cottage filled with aromatic herbs throughout the year. Availability differed greatly according to climate and wealth. Yet wherever such plants could be gathered or cultivated, people appreciated both their pleasant scent and their perceived usefulness. This reminds us once more that medieval people were not passive occupants of unpleasant surroundings. They constantly sought improvement. Sometimes that improvement involved architecture. As centuries passed, building techniques slowly evolved. Stone chimneys became more widespread among wealthier households. Separate kitchens reduced smoke in living quarters. Glazed windows admitted more light while limiting drafts. Raised wooden floors replaced packed earth in many prosperous homes. Better roofing methods improved resistance to rain. Each innovation represented not merely technological progress but another attempt to make domestic life healthier, more comfortable, and easier to maintain. Yet progress rarely solved every problem at once. A chimney carried smoke upward, but ash still accumulated. A larger house offered separate rooms, but also demanded more cleaning. Glass admitted daylight while revealing dust more clearly. Stone resisted fire, yet often felt cold and encouraged condensation. History rarely advances through perfect solutions. Instead, it proceeds through trade-offs. Perhaps one of the most revealing trade-offs involved privacy. As houses gradually developed additional rooms, family members gained greater separation from one another. Sleeping chambers became more distinct. Storerooms became more specialized. This certainly improved aspects of domestic organization. At the same time, additional partitions reduced airflow. Small enclosed chambers could become stuffy. Smoke drifting from fireplaces might linger unexpectedly. Dampness found hidden corners where sunlight rarely reached. Even improvements required new habits of maintenance. One can almost imagine a servant opening shutters each morning, not merely to admit daylight, but to encourage fresh air into spaces that otherwise remained closed throughout the night. Morning routines, therefore, became surprisingly sophisticated. Banked embers revived. Shutters opened. Chamber pots emptied. Beds aired. Blankets folded. Floors swept. Water fetched. Animals fed. Breakfast prepared. Tools gathered. Before much productive work could even begin, an astonishing amount of unseen labor had already taken place. This invisible labor was overwhelmingly repetitive. There was little novelty. Yesterday's ash resembled today's ash. Tomorrow's mud would resemble yesterday's mud. Yet medieval society depended upon millions of these repetitions performed faithfully without applause. When historians examine tax rolls, court records, wills, household accounts, and archaeological excavations, the dramatic events naturally attract attention. Wars reshape kingdoms. Epidemics alter populations. Dynastic marriages redirect politics. But underneath every spectacular event lay ordinary households quietly continuing these same routines. A woman swept while kings negotiated treaties. A servant scrubbed pots while armies assembled. Children gathered kindling while merchants crossed continents. Someone repaired a leaking roof while cathedrals slowly rose over generations. History often remembers the extraordinary because it survives in written records. Yet civilization rests upon the ordinary. This perspective also changes how we understand the appearance of medieval homes themselves. If we entered one unexpectedly, the first impression might not be overwhelming filth. Instead, we would probably notice activity. Someone spinning wool. Someone stirring a pot. Someone mending clothing. Someone trimming a candle. Someone carrying water. Someone sweeping once again, even though the floor would need sweeping again before sunset. The home was not frozen in dirt. This was not complete sanitation by modern standards, but it made a noticeable difference. Curtains around wealthier beds introduced another layer of complexity. Modern readers often assume bed curtains existed purely for privacy. They certainly helped create a more secluded sleeping space, particularly in busy households, but their primary function was often warmth. Large medieval rooms could be surprisingly difficult to heat. Even when a fire burned steadily, much of the warmth escaped upward into high ceilings or drifted through imperfectly sealed windows and doors. Curtains trapped a pocket of warmer air around the bed itself, making winter nights considerably more bearable. Yet those same curtains collected smoke. Dust settled into their folds. Tiny insects found shelter within heavy fabric. Cleaning them required several pairs of hands simply because of their weight. Here once again appears the quiet contradiction that defines so much of medieval domestic life. The very feature that increased comfort also increased housekeeping. Pillows reveal the same pattern. Filled with feathers, wool, moss, or other local materials depending upon wealth and region, they required periodic attention. Covers might be removed for washing if sufficient linen was available. Fillings occasionally needed refreshing. Dampness remained an ever-present concern. The goal was never to create an immaculate sleeping environment. It was to prevent conditions from becoming significantly worse. This distinction is subtle but important. Medieval housekeeping often involved slowing decline rather than achieving perfection. The same philosophy shaped the care of furniture. Consider an ordinary wooden table. Unlike modern furniture protected by synthetic finishes, medieval wooden surfaces responded directly to the environment. Dry air encouraged cracking. Dampness encouraged swelling. Grease from meals slowly darkened the grain. Countless hands polished certain areas through repeated touch while leaving others comparatively rough. Cleaning usually involved cloths, water used carefully, and sometimes abrasive materials for stubborn residues. Excessive moisture could damage wood, so scrubbing required judgment rather than abundance. Benches, stools, and chests displayed similar patterns. A chest storing clothing had to remain dry. One holding grain required protection from rodents. Another containing important documents demanded particular care because parchment and paper responded poorly to dampness. Every object possessed its own small requirements. Perhaps nowhere was this more evident than in the medieval kitchen. The kitchen did not merely produce meals, produced residue. Every loaf of bread left flour upon work surfaces. Every roasted joint released grease. Every pot suspended above the hearth accumulated soot externally while collecting food residue internally. Copper vessels gradually tarnished. Iron rusted if neglected. Wooden bowls dried too quickly if left near intense heat. Earthenware cracked under sudden temperature changes. The medieval cook therefore became, in part, a conservator. Good housekeeping preserved expensive tools for years. Poor housekeeping shortened their useful lives dramatically. Water, once again, determined what could reasonably be accomplished. Because carrying and heating water demanded considerable effort, it was often used thoughtfully rather than generously. Large cooking pots might first be scraped with wooden implements before washing. Residual grease could be loosened using hot water mixed with ash or other mildly abrasive substances. Sand sometimes assisted with stubborn deposits. Modern detergents dissolve grease almost effortlessly. Medieval cleaners relied instead upon patience. The process took longer. Hands performed more of the work. Results depended heavily upon experience. Yet archaeological evidence often shows cookware that remained in service for astonishing lengths of time, suggesting that these methods, while laborious, proved remarkably effective. Another fascinating aspect of medieval domestic life concerns the treatment of light-colored textiles. Linen occupied a special place within the household because its appearance visibly reflected cleanliness. White or pale linen suggested careful maintenance, even if achieving that appearance demanded extraordinary effort. After washing, linen was often spread across grass or exposed to sunlight for extended periods. Modern chemistry explains why this gradually brightened the fabric. Medieval households simply observed that the practice worked. Experience repeatedly taught lessons long before science explained them. This practical knowledge accumulated quietly across generations. One daughter watched her mother. An apprentice observed an experienced servant. A young wife learned from older relatives. Much of medieval housekeeping therefore survived not in books but in memory. Knowledge passed from hand to hand. Indeed, surviving written household manuals represent only a small fraction of what people actually knew. The overwhelming majority of practical domestic knowledge lived within routine itself. How much ash to mix with water, when bedding required airing, which herbs discouraged insects most effectively in a particular region, how to recognize damp grain before spoilage became obvious, how to dry boots without cracking leather, how close to place wet clothing near the fire without scorching it. Such knowledge rarely appeared dramatic enough for chroniclers. Yet without it, everyday life became immeasurably harder. This practical intelligence reminds us that medieval housekeeping demanded considerable skill. It was not simply repetitive labor. It required observation, judgment, experience, adaptability. A family facing an unusually wet autumn adjusted routines differently from one enduring prolonged drought. A harsh winter altered cleaning schedules. An abundant harvest increased storage responsibilities. An outbreak of illness redirected household priorities entirely. The home responded continuously to changing circumstances. Even celebrations created additional work. A feast, whether held by a noble household or a prosperous village family marking an important occasion, generated extraordinary quantities of dishes, spilled food, muddy footprints, discarded rushes, and cooking equipment requiring attention afterward. Hospitality always carried hidden labor. Guests remembered the warmth of the welcome. Servants remembered the cleaning that followed. The same was true after religious festivals, special meals, additional visitors, decorations, candles, extra bedding for overnight guests. Every joyful gathering temporarily increased disorder before ordinary routines slowly restored balance. This cycle repeated itself across the medieval calendar. Ordinary days alternated with extraordinary ones. Yet housekeeping never disappeared. It merely adapted. Perhaps the most revealing aspect of all is that much of this work left almost no physical trace for historians to recover. Archaeologists discover broken pottery, collapsed walls, discarded tools, animal bones, coins, jewelry. What they rarely uncover directly are the countless acts of sweeping, scrubbing, folding, shaking, hanging, brushing, airing, and repairing that once filled those spaces with quiet activity. The evidence survives indirectly, a polished threshold worn smooth by generations of feet, a repaired cooking pot showing decades of continued use, drainage channels built to carry away water, replacement layers within house floors, where marks on furniture, ash deposits near hearths. Each tells a small part of the same story. These homes did not remain standing through luck alone. They survived because people invested extraordinary amounts of effort into preserving them against weather, smoke, moisture, insects, and the ordinary wear of daily life. And yet, despite all that labor, there remained one force that no amount of sweeping, careful storage, or patient maintenance could fully overcome. It arrived not through the doorway or the chimney, but with the changing seasons themselves, quietly altering every room in the house and forcing each family to rethink, once again, what it truly meant to keep a home comfortable, healthy, and as clean as circumstances would allow. And yet, despite all that labor, there remained one force that no amount of sweeping, careful storage, or patient maintenance could fully overcome. It arrived not through the doorway or the chimney, but with the changing seasons themselves, quietly altering every room in the house and forcing each family to rethink, once again, what it truly meant to keep a home comfortable, healthy, and as clean as circumstances would allow. Winter was perhaps the greatest test of every medieval household. Modern heating systems encourage us to think of winter as something kept outside. Walls insulate, radiators warm every room, windows remain tightly sealed, and a steady indoor temperature is maintained with little daily thought. In the medieval home, winter entered gradually. It announced itself first through colder mornings, then through dampness that lingered longer after rain, through shorter days that demanded earlier candlelight, and finally through the constant negotiation between preserving warmth and preserving fresh air. This negotiation lay at the heart of medieval domestic life. Every door opened to admit cold. Every window opened to admit fresh air. Every crack sealed against wind also trapped smoke. Every fire that warmed the room consumed precious fuel while coating walls with another fine layer of soot. The household could never optimize every condition simultaneously. Warmth, dryness, ventilation, cleanliness, and economy constantly competed with one another. Imagine a December morning in Northern Europe. Outside, frost covers the fields. The village remains quiet except for the occasional sound of an axe striking frozen wood. Inside the cottage, yesterday's embers have survived beneath a layer of ash, just enough to spare the family the effort of lighting an entirely new fire. Someone kneels beside the hearth, carefully blowing life back into the coals. Thin streams of smoke begin climbing upward before the flames establish themselves. Almost immediately, another day's cleaning begins. Ash must be removed, but not all of it. Some is saved. Fresh fuel is added carefully. Damp firewood hisses before burning properly. Tiny black particles drift upward, settling invisibly upon nearby shelves, bowls, benches, and clothing. By breakfast, the room already carries the marks of another day's occupation. This gradual accumulation often escaped notice because it happened so slowly. No single fire blackened the rafters. Thousands of fires did. No single meal coated the cooking hooks with grease. Years of meals accomplished that. The medieval household therefore aged visibly. Timber darkened. Stone absorbed smoke. Iron developed a deep black patina. Leather softened and changed color. Wooden bowls acquired smooth, polished surfaces through thousands of washings and countless hands. Many museum reconstructions inadvertently appear cleaner than lived reality because they present objects at a single moment rather than after decades of continuous use. The original owners inhabited buildings that bore the visible memory of everyday life. Winter also changed how families occupied space. During warm months, work spread outdoors whenever possible. Wool might be spun in the yard. Repairs completed beneath open skies. Children played beyond the doorway. Cooking occasionally extended into exterior work areas depending upon the task. Cold weather compressed life inward. More people remained inside for longer hours. Wet cloaks hung drying close to the fire. Boots lined the hearth. Extra blankets appeared. Food stores were opened more frequently. Animals requiring attention drew people repeatedly between house and byre, carrying fresh traces of snow, straw, or mud back inside. The home became busier precisely when cleaning became more difficult. One particularly revealing challenge involved condensation. Modern people rarely think about moisture created simply by breathing, cooking, and heating because modern buildings are designed to manage it. Medieval homes possessed no such hidden systems. Several people sleeping within one room released moisture throughout the night. Pots simmering over the fire released steam. Wet clothing drying indoors added still more humidity. When this warm air encountered cold walls or windows, Dampness lingered. Textiles absorbed it. Timber responded to it. Stored possessions gradually felt heavier. If weather remained persistently wet outside, opportunities for drying bedding and clothing became scarce. This helps explain why fresh air was valued so highly whenever conditions allowed. A bright, dry winter day offered precious opportunities. Blankets might be carried outside despite the cold. Feather beds were shaken vigorously. Chamber pots emptied. Rushes inspected. The house itself seemed to breathe. It is tempting to imagine medieval people resigning themselves to unpleasant indoor conditions throughout winter, yet many sources suggest precisely the opposite. Whenever weather permitted, households seized opportunities to improve their surroundings because they understood, through experience alone, how dramatically a little sunlight and dry air could change the atmosphere inside. Light itself became increasingly valuable. As days shortened, candles consumed a larger share of household resources. Wealth influenced lighting considerably. Beeswax candles burned more cleanly and with less odor but cost substantially more than ordinary tallow. Many modest families relied primarily upon tallow candles, rushlights, or the fire itself. Each source produced its own byproducts. Tallow emitted a distinctive smell. Candles dripped wax. Rushlights burned quickly. Open flames produced soot. The simple act of extending productive hours after sunset gradually darkened the home. Even reading became affected. A monk copying manuscripts in winter worked beneath limited illumination that strained both eyes and patience. A woman mending clothing near the hearth depended upon carefully positioned firelight. Children learning prayers watched shadows dance across timber walls blackened by generations of smoke. Darkness shaped domestic routines almost as much as cleanliness did. Yet spring transformed everything again. The arrival of warmer weather brought relief, but also entirely new responsibilities. Roofs damaged during winter demanded repair. Thatch required inspection. Mud left by melting snow clung stubbornly to paths. Water once frozen now flowed freely, encouraging larger washing days. Bedding emerged outdoors. Walls could be patched where frost had opened new cracks. Spring cleaning, in its broadest sense, was not a single event but a practical response to the accumulated effects of winter. It represented renewal born of necessity. One can easily imagine entire villages subtly changing appearance over several weeks. Doors standing open. Fresh rushes gathered. Children carrying bedding outdoors. Women washing linen near streams. Men repairing fences and roofs. Smoke drifting upward beneath longer daylight. The landscape itself assisted housekeeping once more. Summer, however, replaced one set of concerns with another. Heat accelerated decay. Milk soured more quickly. Meat required immediate preservation. Flies multiplied. Stored water sometimes became stagnant if neglected. The house, once closed tightly against winter winds, now sought every available current of moving air. Shutters remained open. Doors stood ajar whenever practical. Yet every opening welcomed dust alongside the breeze. Harvest preparations added further complications. Fields grew increasingly busy. People spent longer hours outdoors. Tools returned each evening carrying dirt, sap, and plant residue. Storage spaces were prepared for incoming grain. Old supplies inspected before fresh harvests replaced them. Every season therefore produced its own distinctive pattern of cleanliness. The medieval household never followed a perfectly repetitive cycle. Instead, it adapted continuously. This flexibility becomes especially visible when we examine water more closely. Rainwater, where collected, served valuable purposes. Roof runoff could be directed into barrels for washing, cleaning, or other household tasks depending upon local practice and water quality. Wells remained essential, but heavy rainfall occasionally improved supplies while drought made every bucket more precious. In some regions, entire communities depended upon springs whose reliability determined settlement itself. Water therefore connected the household directly to geography. A family living beside an abundant spring experienced domestic life differently from one walking considerable distances to a well. Simple chores expanded or contracted according to landscape. The same principle applied to fuel. Wooded regions enjoyed advantages unavailable on open plains. Families with easier access to firewood could heat more water, dry more clothing, and cook with greater flexibility than those forced to ration every bundle of fuel carefully. The medieval home was never an isolated building. It was the product of forests, rivers, fields, weather, and local resources. This broader perspective helps explain why cleanliness differed from one place to another without reflecting moral superiority or inferiority. A prosperous farming family living beside clean water, abundant woodland, and fertile land possessed opportunities unavailable to equally hard-working families struggling with poorer soil or scarce fuel. Environment shaped domestic life as profoundly as effort did. The same was true within towns. Not every urban neighborhood experienced identical conditions. A house standing beside a busy tannery encountered different smells from one located near a baker's oven. A dwelling close to livestock markets faced different challenges than one beside a quiet parish church. Brewers, smiths, fullers, dyers, fishmongers, and butchers all transformed the atmosphere of surrounding streets. Medieval towns were collections of specialized environments. Each influenced the homes nearby. This reminds us that the phrase "a medieval house" conceals enormous diversity. A Norwegian farmhouse, a London merchant's residence, a Tuscan village cottage, a Flemish townhouse, a Welsh longhouse. Each shared broad similarities while responding to distinct climates, economies, building traditions, and available materials. Their common thread was not identical appearance. It was continual maintenance. One particularly revealing object illustrates this beautifully. The broom. Because brooms wore out through constant use, they were rarely treasured possessions. Made from local brush, birch twigs, heather, broomcorn in later periods, or similar materials, they represented humble craftsmanship rather than luxury. Yet few tools worked more faithfully. Morning after morning, season after season, year after year, the broom quietly opposed disorder without ever expecting complete victory. Perhaps no object better symbolizes medieval housekeeping. Its owner understood that tomorrow would require the same labor once again. And still the floor was swept, the ash removed, the bedding aired, the water carried, the rushes renewed, the fire tended. This endless repetition was not evidence of failure. It was evidence that the household remained alive. Indeed, one of the most striking realizations that emerges from studying medieval homes is that cleanliness was measured less by achieving an impossible ideal than by refusing to surrender to the steady return of disorder. The work itself became the standard. A visitor might judge a home not because it lacked smoke or mud. Every sensible person knew those things existed, but because someone was clearly making the effort. The broom leaning by the door, fresh water waiting in a basin, recently aired linen, a swept hearth, properly stored food. These quiet signs communicated diligence more effectively than spotless surfaces ever could. In that sense, a medieval home was never judged against perfection. It was judged against neglect. And that distinction becomes even more important when we begin looking beyond the physical structure of the house itself, toward the beliefs, customs, and cultural ideas that shaped how medieval people understood cleanliness, not merely as a practical necessity, but as something connected to morality, hospitality, health, and the proper ordering of everyday life. And that distinction becomes even more important when we begin looking beyond the physical structure of the house itself, toward the beliefs, customs, and cultural ideas that shaped how medieval people understood cleanliness, not merely as a practical necessity, but as something connected to morality, hospitality, health, and the proper ordering of everyday life. One of the easiest mistakes we can make when looking back at the medieval world is assuming that cleanliness meant exactly what it means today. Modern societies often connect cleanliness with invisible microorganisms, disinfectants, laboratory-tested hygiene, and scientifically measured sanitation. Medieval Europeans possessed no knowledge of bacteria or viruses in the modern sense. Yet it would be equally mistaken to imagine that they paid little attention to purity, freshness, or the proper care of the body and the home. Their ideas simply rested upon different foundations. Throughout much of medieval Europe, inherited medical traditions from the ancient Mediterranean world remained enormously influential. Physicians educated in universities studied texts derived from writers such as Galen and Hippocrates, whose works emphasized the balance of the body's humors and the importance of environment in maintaining health. Although modern medicine has long moved beyond these theories, they offered medieval practitioners a coherent way of understanding why certain places felt healthier than others. Fresh air occupied an especially important place within this way of thinking. A room that remained stagnant, smoky, or foul-smelling was not simply unpleasant. Many believed such conditions could weaken the body or encourage illness. Consequently, whenever weather permitted, windows and doors were opened, bedding aired, and unpleasant odors reduced where practical. Notice the recurring pattern. Without knowing about microbes, people nevertheless arrived at practices that often produced genuine benefits. This does not mean every medieval belief proved accurate. Some explanations reflected medical theories that we now know were mistaken. Others combined practical observation with religious symbolism. Still others relied upon generations of accumulated experience rather than written scholarship. Together, however, they encouraged people to remain attentive to their surroundings. Smell, in particular, occupied a surprisingly important place in medieval thought. Today, we often separate odor from cleanliness. Something may smell pleasant while remaining unhygienic, or smell unpleasant without posing any real danger. Medieval people generally viewed this relationship rather differently. Pleasant scents frequently suggested order. Rotting smells suggested corruption. A fragrant chamber implied careful housekeeping. Persistent foulness hinted that something required attention. This perspective influenced domestic habits in countless subtle ways. Bundles of herbs might be hung from beams not solely because they looked attractive, but because their fragrance improved the atmosphere of a room. Sweet-smelling plants sometimes found their way beneath fresh rushes scattered across floors. During festivals or important occasions, greenery decorated interiors not merely for visual beauty, but because living plants contributed freshness to enclosed spaces. The result was a home that appealed to multiple senses at once. Sight mattered. Smell mattered. Warmth mattered. Even sound contributed to the overall impression of domestic order. A quiet household suggested something different from one filled with constant shouting, disorder, or confusion. This broader understanding of household management extended naturally into hospitality. If a traveler approached a medieval home seeking shelter, the welcome offered often reflected far more than generosity alone. Hospitality carried moral significance throughout much of medieval Christian Europe. Religious teachings repeatedly encouraged care for strangers, pilgrims, and those in need. Receiving a guest, therefore, involved preparing the household itself. Fresh water might be offered for washing hands. A place near the fire prepared. Cleanest available linen produced. Food served in orderly fashion. Even families possessing very modest resources often attempted to present their home with dignity. This dignity did not require luxury. It required care. Imagine arriving after a long journey through muddy autumn roads. Your boots are soaked. Your cloak smells faintly of damp wool and wood smoke. A household welcomes you inside. Someone takes your cloak toward the hearth where it may dry. Another pours water over your hands into a waiting basin. Bread appears. Perhaps cheese, perhaps warm pottage. The room itself carries familiar sense of fire, herbs, and cooked grain. Nothing is extravagant. Everything suggests thoughtful preparation. Such experiences shaped reputations. A family known for orderly hospitality earned respect extending well beyond the walls of its own house. Even monasteries became famous for the quality of their hospitality. Travelers frequently judged religious communities by the condition of guest quarters, meals, and general household order. The monastery served not only as a spiritual institution but also as a functioning household on an unusually large scale. The same values appeared within urban society. Guild regulations occasionally included expectations regarding workshops and commercial premises. Customers naturally preferred purchasing bread from orderly bakeries or cloth from merchants whose premises suggested careful management. Domestic order, therefore, possessed economic consequences as well. Trust often began with appearances. If a shop seemed neglected, potential customers might quietly question the quality of its goods. This connection between cleanliness and reputation reminds us once again that housekeeping represented much more than repetitive labor. Communicated character. Yet we should be careful not to idealize medieval domestic standards. There remained enormous practical limits. Soap, for example, deserves closer examination. Soap certainly existed throughout the Middle Ages, but its availability varied considerably according to region, wealth, and local production. In some areas, it remained relatively expensive. Elsewhere, households produced simpler forms themselves using combinations of animal fats and alkaline substances derived from wood ash. The resulting products differed greatly from modern commercial soaps. Some proved quite effective. Others were harsh upon the skin. Their quality depended heavily upon ingredients and skill during preparation. Because soap represented valuable labor as much as valuable material, it was generally used thoughtfully. Nothing was squandered casually. This principle extended beyond soap into nearly every cleaning supply. Cloths were reused repeatedly, brushes repaired, buckets patched, broken pottery occasionally repurposed for entirely new tasks. The household economy rewarded ingenuity. A cracked cooking vessel might become storage. Worn linen transformed into cleaning cloths. Old straw entered compost heaps. Ash became cleaning agent. Almost everything experienced several useful lives before finally becoming waste. Modern historians sometimes describe this as a circular household economy. People living within it probably considered it simply common sense. Scarcity encouraged creativity. Another revealing aspect of medieval cleanliness concerns children's education. Young children did not suddenly become responsible adults at a particular birthday. Instead, responsibility entered life gradually through countless ordinary tasks. A small child might first gather scattered twigs, later carry kindling, soon afterwards help shake blankets outdoors, eventually fetch water under supervision, still later learn how to sweep properly without merely moving dirt from one corner to another. These small lessons accomplished more than household maintenance. They introduced discipline, patience, observation, awareness of shared responsibility. A well-kept home depended upon everyone contributing according to age and ability. Even play sometimes blended into work. Children chasing chickens from newly swept floors, gathering herbs for drying, collecting eggs, or helping sort vegetables performed useful tasks while gradually absorbing household routines that would remain with them throughout adulthood. Knowledge therefore reproduced itself quietly, not through formal instruction alone, through imitation, through repetition, through daily participation. The medieval home functioned as one of society's most important schools. Marriage also transformed domestic responsibilities. A newly established household faced daunting challenges. Furniture had to be acquired or inherited, cooking vessels assembled, bedding prepared, tools gathered, food stores established, fuel secured. Every object represented labor already invested by someone. Consequently, beginning a household involved more than obtaining shelter. It meant creating an environment capable of sustaining continuous maintenance. This partly explains why household goods frequently appeared in wills and inheritance records. Beds, chests, cooking pots, tables, linen, candlesticks, each possessed substantial value. To inherit them meant inheriting not merely possessions but the accumulated efforts of previous generations. One particularly moving detail found in many medieval inventories is the repeated appearance of repaired objects. Modern consumer culture often encourages replacement. The medieval household encouraged preservation. A cracked bowl carefully mended. Patched blanket still providing warmth. A chest reinforced with new iron straps. A chair repaired several times across decades. These objects bore visible histories. Far from being embarrassing, repair often represented sensible stewardship. Every repair postponed expensive replacement. Every repaired object reduced waste. Every successful mending extended the life of valuable materials. There is something quietly comforting about this perspective. The medieval home was rarely expected to appear new. It was expected to remain useful. Perhaps that is why surviving medieval interiors often strike us as simultaneously worn and orderly. where signaled use, neglect signaled failure. Those were not the same thing. A polished table scarred by generations of meals reflected continuity. A neglected table collapsing from rot reflected abandonment. The distinction mattered deeply. Even firewood stacks reveal this philosophy. Properly arranged wood dried more effectively. Neatly stored fuel burned better. Careless piles encouraged dampness. Thus, stacking firewood became another small act of housekeeping. Likewise with grain. Properly stored sacks protected an entire winter's food supply. Carelessly managed grain invited moisture, insects, rodents, and hunger. Again and again we discover the same lesson. Domestic order created security. This becomes especially meaningful when viewed against the uncertainties of medieval life. Harvests sometimes failed. Storms damaged roofs. Illness interrupted ordinary routines. Unexpected guests arrived. Livestock died. Political unrest disrupted trade. The household could not control these larger events. It could, however, control how carefully its own resources were managed. Cleaning, therefore, became one expression of resilience. Not because sweeping a floor prevented famine, but because orderly habits helped families endure difficult times more successfully. Indeed, many medieval moral writings praised moderation, diligence, and careful stewardship precisely because these qualities strengthened both households and communities. Housekeeping belonged within that broader moral landscape. A diligent person swept not only because dirt accumulated. They swept because responsible care for one's household reflected responsible care for one's obligations. Yet all these ideals met their greatest challenge whenever disease entered the home. Whether the illness proved mild or severe, ordinary domestic routines changed almost immediately. Beds remained occupied throughout the day. Fresh water was needed more frequently. Soiled linen accumulated. Cooking shifted toward simpler meals. Windows might be opened more often or, according to different medical advice, kept closed under certain circumstances. Relatives, neighbors, and servants adjusted their routines accordingly. Illness transformed every room. And it was during these moments that medieval ideas about cleanliness, fresh air, smell, comfort, medicine, and household order came together most visibly, forcing ordinary families to make difficult decisions with the knowledge available to them. Long before modern science could explain why some practices helped, why others failed, and why certain homes seemed to recover while others faced far darker outcomes. And it was during these moments that medieval ideas about cleanliness, fresh air, smell, comfort, medicine, and household order came together most visibly, forcing ordinary families to make difficult decisions with the knowledge available to them. Long before modern science could explain why some practices helped, why others failed, and why certain homes seemed to recover while others faced far darker outcomes. Illness changed the meaning of every familiar object inside the house. A bed that usually represented warmth and rest suddenly became the center of constant attention. The fire was no longer maintained only for cooking or comfort, but to heat water, prepare broths, warm stones or bricks wrapped in cloth, and keep the sick from becoming dangerously cold. Linen that ordinarily lasted several days might now need changing more frequently. Bowls, cups, and spoons traveled repeatedly between the hearth and the bedside. The ordinary rhythm of housekeeping quietly rearranged itself around one vulnerable person. In many households, there was no separate sick room. Especially among ordinary farming families, the ill remained within the same principal living space where everyone else continued eating, spinning, repairing tools, preparing meals, and sleeping. The practical reasons were obvious. The fire remained there. Warmth remained there. Water was closest. Assistance could be given immediately. Yet this closeness created another paradox. The place best suited to caring for someone was also the place where the rest of household life continued uninterrupted. From a modern perspective, we instinctively think of isolation. Medieval families usually thought first of care. That distinction is important. People certainly recognized that some illnesses appeared to spread from person to person. During outbreaks of particular diseases, many communities adopted measures that limited contact in various ways. But in ordinary domestic sicknesses, fevers, coughs, injuries, stomach complaints, or the countless ailments that visited medieval households, the practical realities of caring for relatives often outweighed the possibility of physical separation. This reminds us once again that medieval housekeeping cannot be understood apart from human relationships. A clean room mattered. A cared-for person mattered more. The same balance appears in medieval medical advice. Many surviving texts encourage moderation rather than extremes. Fresh air was often recommended, but not chilling drafts upon weakened patients. Warmth was valued, but excessive heat could also be discouraged depending upon the illness being treated. Clean linen appeared repeatedly because fresh cloth offered obvious comfort, even if its deeper medical value remained imperfectly understood. Perhaps nowhere is historical empathy more necessary than here. It is easy to identify treatments that modern medicine would reject. Bloodletting, complex herbal mixtures of uncertain effectiveness, astrological timing, or humoral balancing often seem strange to contemporary readers. Yet surrounding these practices existed a great deal of practical nursing that remains recognizable today. Offer water, keep bedding reasonably dry, reduce unpleasant odors, provide warmth, prepare nourishing food if possible, remain nearby, encourage rest, comfort the patient. These acts required no advanced medical theory. They required patience. In many ways, housekeeping became healthcare. A person recovering from illness depended upon the ordinary competence of the household as much as upon any physician who might visit only occasionally, if at all. For poorer families especially, professional medical assistance remained limited by geography, expense, and availability. Most illnesses therefore unfolded under the care of relatives, whose greatest strengths lay in experience rather than formal education. Generations accumulated practical observations. Which broth seemed easiest to digest? Which herbs soothed sore throats? How often damp bedding should be changed? How to keep a fire burning through the night without exhausting precious fuel? How to recognize when an illness seemed unusually dangerous? These observations formed part of domestic knowledge every bit as much as sweeping floors or preserving food. One particularly revealing detail concerns water. Fresh water became even more valuable during illness than under ordinary circumstances. Yet obtaining it remained physically demanding. Someone still had to leave the house, lower buckets into the well, carry heavy containers home, heat what required warming, and keep enough available for cooking, drinking, and washing. A serious illness therefore increased work for everyone else. The patient rested. The household worked harder. This hidden labor rarely appears in medieval chronicles. A nobleman's illness might be recorded. The queen's recovery celebrated. A monastery's epidemic described. But the daughter carrying extra buckets from the village well, the elderly mother washing additional linen, or the younger brother gathering twice as much firewood usually remained invisible to history. And yet they were indispensable. Household order also mattered after recovery. Bedding needed airing. Rooms swept thoroughly. Cooking utensils returned to ordinary use. Clothing washed whenever circumstances permitted. The house gradually resumed its familiar rhythm. In this sense, housekeeping marked the transition from sickness back toward ordinary life. But disease was not the only event that tested the resilience of medieval homes. Birth did as well. A childbirth transformed the household in remarkably similar ways. Warm water again became essential. Fresh linen suddenly carried enormous importance. The fire burned steadily. Beds were rearranged. Relatives or experienced neighboring women often gathered to assist. The home itself adapted to the needs of one extraordinary day. For a short time, every ordinary routine revolved around a single room. The newborn child entered not a spotless modern nursery, but a lived-in medieval household already rich with familiar smells, sounds, and textures. The crackling hearth, the scent of wool blankets, wooden beams darkened by smoke, fresh rushes recently scattered beneath the bed, the quiet movements of family members trying not to disturb mother or child. These first impressions remind us that cleanliness in medieval life rarely meant creating sterile environments. It meant creating environments capable of supporting life. Death, too, belonged within the household. Most medieval people died at home rather than in institutions resembling modern hospitals. Consequently, the same rooms that witnessed births also witnessed final illnesses and farewells. Family members prepared bodies according to local custom. Linen appeared once more, water once more, candles once more. The home accompanied every stage of existence. This continuity gave domestic spaces emotional significance beyond their physical appearance. A smoke-darkened beam overhead might have watched 3 generations grow beneath it. A heavy table could have hosted wedding feasts, ordinary suppers, harvest celebrations, and quiet morning meals alike. A wooden chest might contain clothing carefully preserved across decades. Nothing in the medieval home existed merely as decoration. Objects accumulated memory. This may explain why so many possessions remained in use for remarkably long periods. They represented continuity. Replacing them unnecessarily made little sense. Repairing them preserved not only value but familiarity. Consider the hearth once again. Earlier we explored its role as the source of smoke that helped make medieval homes feel perpetually less than clean. Yet the hearth was simultaneously the emotional center of the house. Family conversations gathered around it. Winter evenings unfolded beside it. Meals emerged from it. Travelers warmed themselves before it. Children learned household tasks within its light. The very source of soot was also the source of belonging. History often presents us with such contradictions. Comfort produced inconvenience. Warmth produced smoke. Hospitality produced extra cleaning. Abundance produced additional storage problems. The more closely we examine ordinary life, the more these trade-offs become visible. Another revealing example appears in floor coverings. Rushes have already accompanied us throughout much of this journey, but they deserve one final, closer look because they have become surrounded by popular myths. A common story claims that medieval floors were covered with layers of rushes left untouched for years, supposedly hiding astonishing accumulations of refuse beneath them. The evidence suggests a more complicated reality. Fresh rushes certainly covered many floors. Older material undoubtedly accumulated dirt if neglected. Yet responsible households generally removed and renewed rush coverings with some regularity. Exactly how often depended upon wealth, local custom, availability of fresh material, and the intensity of household use. The key point is that rushes required management. Neglected rushes became unpleasant. Renewed rushes improved comfort noticeably. Once again, medieval cleanliness depended less upon possessing perfect materials than upon maintaining ordinary ones carefully. The same applies to walls. Whitewashed interiors, particularly where lime was available, offered practical advantages beyond simple appearance. White surfaces reflected scarce daylight, making interiors brighter. Fresh lime wash could also cover smoke stains accumulated over time, giving a room renewed freshness. Many households therefore periodically renewed interior surfaces rather than allowing years of gradual discoloration to remain unchecked. The medieval home continually repaired itself. Walls received fresh coatings, roofs new thatch, doors new hinges, furniture new pegs, clothing new patches. The house remained alive because its occupants refused to let small problems become large ones. This culture of continual maintenance also influenced attitudes toward time itself. Modern people often postpone repairs because replacement remains comparatively affordable. Medieval households frequently adopted the opposite strategy. Repair early, repair often, repair patiently. A loose roof tile today prevented a leaking ceiling tomorrow. A small crack sealed before winter prevented greater damage after repeated freezing. A worn shoe repaired now saved valuable leather. These habits extended naturally into cleaning. Sweep before dirt became deeply embedded. Dry clothing before mold appeared. Store grain properly before pests multiplied. The rhythm of housekeeping therefore reflected a wider philosophy of prevention. Not because prevention guaranteed success, but because neglect almost guaranteed failure. One begins to appreciate why domestic competence inspired genuine respect. A well-managed household represented accumulated wisdom. Visitors noticed. Neighbors noticed. Children learned from it. Apprentices carried those habits into future homes. The influence extended quietly across generations. Perhaps this is why medieval literature, sermons, and practical writings so often praise diligence without drawing sharp distinctions between moral virtue and domestic responsibility. To maintain one's household faithfully was, in many traditions, part of maintaining one's place within the wider community. The home stood as the smallest unit of social stability. Its order supported the village. The village supported the region supported the kingdom. Large historical events rested upon remarkably ordinary foundations. When historians describe medieval Europe, attention naturally gravitates toward castles, crusades, kings, monasteries, cathedrals, guilds, and markets. Yet beneath every one of those institutions existed countless households quietly performing these same repetitive acts of maintenance every morning and every evening. Someone always swept. Someone always fetched water. Someone always mended clothing. Someone always banked the fire before sleep. And while rulers argued over borders or merchants crossed seas carrying valuable cargo, another kind of work continued almost unnoticed. The patient, repetitive labor that kept medieval homes functioning despite smoke, dampness, insects, mud, illness, changing weather, and the constant pressure of ordinary life. It is that quiet persistence, more than any single dirty floor or smoky ceiling, that reveals why medieval homes never truly felt clean, and why the people who lived within them developed such remarkable skill at balancing comfort, necessity, and survival. Yet there is still another side to this story waiting just beyond the threshold, because the condition of the house can never be fully separated from the condition of the streets, lanes, wells, and neighborhoods that surrounded it every single day. And perhaps that is the quiet lesson this journey has been leading us toward all along. When we first hear the phrase, a medieval home, it is easy to picture only smoke-blackened rafters, muddy floors, dim light, and uncomfortable living conditions. Those details are certainly part of the story, but by themselves they leave us with an incomplete picture. The more closely we have looked, the more complicated that picture has become. A medieval home was rarely clean in the modern sense. Smoke drifted through living rooms. Ash settled where it was least welcome. Mud crossed thresholds with every season. Insects returned despite every effort to drive them away. Dampness lingered after rain. Clothing carried the scent of wood fires. Bedding demanded endless care. Floors never stayed freshly swept for long. And yet none of those things meant the people living there had abandoned the idea of cleanliness. Quite the opposite. Again and again, we have found evidence of ordinary men and women trying to improve their surroundings with the resources they possessed. They swept because sweeping mattered. They aired bedding because fresh air mattered. They repaired roofs because dry shelter mattered. They stored food carefully because a single mistake might cost an entire winter's supply. They mended clothing because every garment represented weeks of labor. They washed linen when circumstances allowed because comfort, dignity, and good order mattered to them just as surely as they matter to us. The difference lay not in values, but in circumstances. Modern homes quietly solve thousands of problems before we even notice them. Central heating prevents dampness. Glass windows seal out wind and insects. Indoor plumbing provides clean water almost instantly. Electric light replaces smoky flames. Refrigeration slows decay. Modern building materials resist rot. Vacuum cleaners remove dust that medieval brooms could only chase across a floor. Washing machines perform in an hour work that once consumed an entire day. Because these systems operate so effortlessly, it is easy to forget how much labor they have replaced. For medieval families, there was no hidden infrastructure. The household itself was the infrastructure. Every bucket of water arrived because someone carried it. Every warm room existed because someone gathered fuel. Every repaired wall stood because someone mixed fresh daub. Every loaf of bread required grain that someone had harvested, milled, kneaded, and baked. Every reasonably comfortable bed depended upon someone replacing straw, airing blankets, tightening ropes, and keeping insects under control as best they could. The home functioned because people never stopped working for it. Perhaps that is why medieval domestic life appears both familiar and distant at the same time. The emotions remain recognizable. Parents worried about children. Families welcomed guests. Neighbors helped during illness. Couples built households together. People celebrated births, mourned deaths, shared meals, laughed around the fire, and searched for comfort at the end of long working days. What changed was the physical effort required to support those ordinary moments. Comfort was handmade, cleanliness was handmade, warmth was handmade, even rest was handmade. Looking back across the centuries, we may admire castles, cathedrals, illuminated manuscripts, or magnificent works of craftsmanship. But beneath every great achievement stood millions of ordinary homes whose stories were rarely written down. The woman beating dust from blankets beneath a bright spring sky, the child carrying another bucket from the village well, the elderly man repairing a loose roof before autumn rain, the servant sweeping ash from yesterday's fire, the merchant's wife carefully airing precious linen, the farmer replacing damp straw inside a mattress before winter returned. None of them expected perfection. They expected tomorrow, and tomorrow would require the same work again. That quiet persistence is perhaps the most remarkable part of medieval domestic life. Not because those homes were clean, not because they were comfortable, but because generation after generation continued to create places of warmth, order, hospitality, and belonging inside buildings that constantly pushed back against those ambitions. The medieval home was never truly finished. It was always becoming, always being repaired, always being cleaned, always being lived in, and perhaps that is why it feels surprisingly human. If there is one modern misunderstanding worth leaving behind, it is the idea that medieval people simply accepted dirt because they did not know any better. The historical evidence points toward something far more thoughtful. They understood disorder intimately. They recognized its causes, even if not always in scientific terms. And they devoted extraordinary amounts of time, skill, and patience to holding it back. Their victory was never permanent, but it was renewed every morning. The next time you sweep a floor, open a window, wash a blanket, wipe a kitchen table, or enjoy the quiet comfort of a warm, dry room on a cold evening, it may be worth remembering just how much invisible work previous generations invested in making those ordinary moments feel effortless. History is often remembered through kings, battles, and great monuments. But much of civilization has always depended upon quieter hands. The hands that carried water, the hands that mended roofs, the hands that stirred the fire before dawn, the hands that swept yesterday's ash away, fully aware that tomorrow there would be more. Those hands rarely appear in chronicles. Yet without them, the medieval world could never have endured. And perhaps that is the most enduring truth hidden inside these ordinary homes. Their walls may never have been perfectly clean, but they sheltered lives shaped by resilience, resourcefulness, and a determination to create comfort wherever comfort could be found. Thank you for spending this quiet journey through the everyday realities of the medieval home. Before you go, I'd love to know, what detail from ordinary medieval life surprised you the most? Or what other overlooked corner of history would you enjoy exploring next? And if you enjoy these calm, thoughtful journeys into the past, I hope you'll join us again for another evening of quietly fascinating history.